Chapter 7. The Solution. Next morning after breakfast, we found Inspector MacDonald and Mr. White Mason seated in close consultation in a small parlor of the local police sergeant. Upon the table in front of them were piled a number of letters and telegrams, which they were carefully sorting and docketing. 3 had been placed upon one side. Very true. Still on the track of the elusive bicyclist? Holmes asked cheerfully. What is the latest on the ruffian? MacDonald pointed ruefully to his heap of correspondence. He is at present reported in Leicester, Nottingham, Southampton, Derby, East Ham, Richmond, and 14 other places. In 3 of them, East Ham, Leicester, and Liverpool, there is a clear case against him, and he has actually been arrested. The country seems full of fugitives in yellow coats. Dear me, said Holmes sympathetically. Now, Mr. Mac and you, Mr. White Mason, I wish to give you a very earnest piece of advice. When I went into the case with you, I bargained, as you will no doubt remember, that I should not present you with the half-proved theories, but that I should retain and work out my own ideas until I had satisfied myself that they were correct. For this reason, I am not at the present moment telling you all that is in my mind. On the other hand, I said that I would play the game fairly by you, and I do not think that it is a fair game to allow you for one unnecessary moment to waste your energies upon a profitless task. Therefore, I am here to advise you this morning, and my advice to you is summed up in 3 words. Abandon the case. MacDonald and White Mason stared in amazement at their celebrated colleague. You consider it hopeless, cried the inspector. I consider your case to be hopeless. I do not consider that it is hopeless to arrive at the truth. But the cyclist, he is not an invention. We have a description, his valise, his bicycle. The fellow must be somewhere. Why should we not get him? Yes, no doubt he is somewhere, and no doubt we shall get him. But I would not have you waste your energies in East Ham or Liverpool. I am sure that we can find some shorter cut to the result. You're holding something back. It's hardly fair of you, Mr. Holmes. The inspector was annoyed. You know my methods of work, Mr. Mac, but I will hold it back for the shortest time possible. I only wish to verify the details in one way, which can very readily be done, and then I take my bow and return to London, leaving my results entirely at your service. I owe you too much to act otherwise, for in my own experience I cannot recall any more singular and interesting study. This is clean beyond me, Mr. Holmes. We saw you when you returned from Tunbridge Wells last night, and you were in general agreement with our results. What has happened since then to give you a completely new idea of the case? Well, since you ask me, I spent, as I told you that I would, some hours last night in the manor house. Well, what happened? I can only give you the very general answer to that for the moment. By the way, I have been reading a short but clear and interesting account of the old building, purchasable at a modest sum of 1 penny from the local tobacconist. Here Holmes drew out a small tract, embellished with a rude engraving of the ancient manor house, from his waistcoat pocket. It immensely adds to the zest of an investigation, my dear Mr. Mac, when one of the conscious sympathy of the historical atmosphere was one's surroundings. Don't look so impatient, for I assure you that even so bold an account on this raises some sort of picture of the past in one's mind. Permit me to give you an example. Erected in the 5th year of the reign of King James I, and standing upon the site of a much older building, the manor house of Burlstone presents one of the finest surveying examples of the moated Jacobean residence. and making a fool of us, Mr. Holmes. Tut, tut, Mr. Mac. The first sign of temper I have detected in you. Well, I won't read it verbatim, since you feel so strongly upon the subject. But when I tell you that there is some account of the taking of the place of Parliamentary Council in 1644, of the concealment of Charles for several days in the course of the Civil War, and finally of a visit there by the second George, you will admit that there are various associations of interest connected with this ancient house. I don't doubt it, Mr. Holmes, but that is no business of ours. Is it not? Is it not? Breadth of view, my dear Mr. Mac, is one of the essentials of our profession. The interplay of ideas and the oblique uses of knowledge are often the extraordinary interest. You will excuse me these remarks from one who, though a mere connoisseur of crime, is still rather older and perhaps more experienced than yourself. I'm the first to admit that, said the detective heartily. You get to your point, I admit, but you are such a deuced round-the-corner way of doing it. Well, I'll drop the past history and get down to the present-day facts. I called last night, as I have already said, at the Manor House. I did not see either Mr. Barker or Mrs. Douglas. I saw no necessity to disturb them, but I was pleased to hear that the lady was not visibly pining, and that she had partaken in an excellent dinner. My visit was specifically made to the good of one Mr. Ames, with whom I had exchanged some amiabilities, which culminated in his allowing me, without reference to anyone else, to sit alone for a time and study. What? With that? I ejaculated. No, everything is in order now. Yeah, you gave permission from that, Mr. Mac, as I was informed. The room was in its normal state, and in it I passed an instructive quarter of an hour. Well, what were you doing? Oh, not to make a mystery of so simple a matter, I was looking for the missing dumbbell. It has always bulked rather than large in my estimate of the case. I ended up by finding it. Where? Ah, there we come to the edge of the unexplored. Let me go a little further. A very little further, and I promise you that I shall share everything that I know. Well, we're bound to take you on your own terms, said the inspector. But when it comes to telling us to abandon a case, why in the name of goodness should we abandon the case? For the simple reason, my dear Mr. Mac, that you have not got the first idea what it is that you are investigating. We're investigating the murder of Mr. John Douglas of Burlestone Manor. Yes? Yes, you are. But don't trouble to trace the mysterious gentleman upon the bicycle. I assure you that it won't help you. Then what do you suggest we do with that? I will tell you exactly what to do, if you will do it. Well, I'm bound to say I've always found you had a reason behind all your queer ways. I'll do what you advise. And you, Mr. Mason White? The country detective looked helplessly from one to the other. Mr. Holmes and his methods were new to him. Oh, if it is good enough for the inspector, it is good enough for me, he said at last. Capital, said Holmes. Oh, then, I should recommend a nice cheery country walk for both of you. They tell me that the views of Brostone Ridge over the Wold are very remarkable. No doubt lunch could be got in some suitable hostelry, though my ignorance of the country prevents me from recommending one. And in the evening, tired but happy. Man, what are you giving us, a joke? Asked MacDonald, rising angrily from his chair. Well, spend the day as you like, said Holmes, patting him cheerfully on the shoulder. Do what you like and go where you will, but meet me here before dusk without fail. Without fail, Mr. Mac. That sounds more like sanity. All of it was excellent advice, but I don't insist, so long as you are here when I need you. But now, before we part, I want you to write a note to Mr. Barker. Well, I'll dictate it, if you like. Right, eh? Dear sir, it has struck me that it is our duty to drain the moat, in the hope that we may find some... It's impossible, said the inspector. I made inquiry. Tut, Tut, my dear sir, do please do what I ask you. Well, go on. In the hope that we may find something which may bear upon our investigation. I have made arrangements, and the workmen will be at work early tomorrow morning diverting the stream. Impossible! Diverting the stream. So I thought it best to explain matters beforehand. Now, sign that, and send it by hand upon 4 o'clock. At that hour we shall meet again in this room. Until then, we can each do what we like, for I can assure you that this inquiry has come to a definite pause. The evening was drawing when we were reassembled. Holmes was very serious in his manner, curious myself, and the detectives obviously cynical and annoyed. Well, gentlemen, said my friend gravely, I am asking you now to put everything to the test with me, and you will judge for yourself whether the observations which I have made justify the conclusions to which I have come. It is a chill evening, and I do not know how long our expedition may last, so I beg that you will wear your warmest coats. It is of the most importance that we should be in our places before it grows dark, so, with your permission, we will get started at once. We had passed along the outer bounds of the Manor House Park until we came to a place where there was a gap in the rails which fenced it. Through this we slipped, and then, in a gathering gloom, we followed Holmes until we had reached a shrubbery which lies nearly opposite the main door and the drawbridge. The latter had not been raised. Holmes crouched down behind a screen of laurels, and we all three followed his example. Well, what are we to do now? Asked MacDonald with some gruffness. Possess our souls in patience, and make as little noise as possible, Holmes answered. What are we here for at all? I really think you might treat us with more frankness. Holmes laughed. Watson insists that I am the dramaticist in real life, he said. Some touch of the artist wells up within me, and calls insistently for a well-staged performance. Surely our profession, Mr. Mac, we would be drab and sordid if we did not sometimes set the scene as to glorify our results. A blunt accusation, the brutal tap on the shoulder. What can one make of such a denouement? But the quick interference, the subtle traps, and a clever forecast of coming events, the triumphant vindication of bold theories, are these not the pride and the justification of our life's work? At the present moment you thrill with the glamour of the situation and the anticipation of the hunter. Where would that thrill be if I had been as definite as a timetable? I only ask a little patience, Mr. Mac, and all will be clear to you. Well, I hope the pride and justification and the rest of it will come before we get a death of cold, said the London detective, with comic resignation. We all had good reasons to join him in the aspiration, for our vigil was a long and bitter one. Slowly the shadows darkened over the long, sombre face of the old house. A damp, cold reek from the moat chilled us to the bones and set our teeth chattering. There was a single lamp over the gateway and a steady globe of light in the fatal study. Everything else was dark and still. And how long is this to last? Asked the inspector suddenly. And what is it we're watching for? I have no more notion than how long it is to last, Holmes answered with some asperity. If criminals would always schedule their movements like railway trains, it would be certainly more convenient for us all. And to what it is well, that's what we are waiting for. As he spoke, the yellow light in the study was obscured by somebody passing to and fro before it. The laurels among which we lay were immediately opposite the window, not more than 100 feet from it. Presently it was thrown open with a whining of hinges, and we could dimly see the dark outline of a man's head and shoulders looking out into the gloom. For some minutes he peered forth in a furtive, stealthy fashion, as one who wishes to be assured that he is unobserved. Then he leaned forward, and in the instant silence we were aware of his soft lapping and agitating water. He seemed to be stirring up the moat with something which he held in his hand. Then suddenly he hauled something in as a fisherman lands a fish, with a large round object which obscured the light as he dragged it through the open casement. "Now!" cried Holmes. "Now!" We were all upon our feet, staggering after him with our stiffened limbs, whilst he, with one of those outflames of nervous energy which would make him on occasion both the most active and strongest man that I have ever known, ran swiftly across the bridge and rang violently at the bell. There was a rasping of bolts from the other side, and the amazed Ames stood in the entrance. Holmes brushed him aside without a word, and followed by us all, rushed into the room which had been occupied by the man whom we had been watching. The oil lamp on the table represented the glow which we had seen from the outside. It was now in the hand of Cecil Barker, who held it towards us as we entered. Its light shone upon his strong, resolute, clean-shaven face and his menacing eyes. "What the devil is the meaning in all this?" he cried. "What are you after, anyhow?" Holmes took a swift glance round and pounced upon the sodden bundle tied together with a cord, which lay where it had been thrust under the writing table. "This is what we are after, Mr. Barker, this bundle, weighed with a dumbbell, which you have raised from the bottom of the moat." Barker stared at Holmes with amazement in his face. "How in thunder came you to know anything about it?" he asked. "Simply that I put it there." "You put it there? You?" "Perhaps I should have said replaced it there," said Holmes. "You remember, Inspector MacDonald, that I was somewhat struck by the absence of the dumbbell. I drew your attention to it. But with the pressure of other events, you hardly had time to give it the consideration which would have enabled you to draw the deductions from it. When water is near and the weight is missing, it is not far-fetched supposition that something has been sunk in the water. The idea was at least worth testing. So with the help of Ames, who admitted me into the room, and the crook of Dr. Watson's umbrella, I was able to last night fish up and inspect this bundle. It was of the first importance, however, that we should be able to prove who placed it there. This we accomplished by the very obvious device of announcing that the moat would be drained tomorrow, which had, of course, the effect that whoever had hidden the bundle would most certainly withdraw it in the moment that darkness enabled him to do so. We have no fewer than 4 witnesses as to who it was who took advantage of the opportunity, and so, Mr. Barker, I think the word lies now with you." Sherlock Holmes put the sopping bundle on the table beside the lamp and undid the cord which bound it. From within he extracted a dumbbell, which he tossed down to its fellow in the corner. Then he drew forth a pair of boots. "American, as you perceived," he remarked, pointing to the toes. Then he laid upon the table a long and deadly sheath knife. Finally, he unravelled the bundle of clothing, comprising of a complete set of underclothes, socks, a grey tweed suit, and a short yellow overcoat. "The clothes are remarkable and commonplace," remarked Holmes, "save only for the overcoat, which is full of suggestive touches." He held it tenderly towards the light, whilst his long, thin fingers flickered over it. "Here, as you perceive, is an inner pocket prolonging into the lining, in such a fashion as to give ample space for a truncated fowling piece. The tailor's tab is on the neck. Neil, outfitter, Vermissa, USA. I have spent an instructive afternoon in the Vector's library and have enlarged my envelope by adding the fact that Vermissa is a flourishing little town at the head of one of the best-known coal and iron valleys in the United States. I have some recollection, Mr. Barker, that you associated coal districts with Mr. Douglas's first wife, and it would surely not be too far-fetched for the influence of the VV upon the card on the dead body which might stand for Vermissa Valley. Oh, that is the very valley which sends forth emissaries of murder. May that be the Valley of Fear, which is now heard. Such is fairly clear. And now, Mr. Barker, I seem to be standing rather in the way of your explanation." It was a sight to see Cecil Barker's expressive face during this exposition of the great detective. Anger, amazement, Consternation and indecision swept over him in turn. Finally, he took refuge in somewhat acid irony. You know a lot, Mr. Holmes. Perhaps you had better tell us some more, he sneered. I have no doubt that I could tell you a great deal more, Mr. Barker, but it would come with a better grace from you. You think so, do you? Well, I can say that if there's any secret around here, it's not my secret, and I am not to give it away. Well, if you take that line, Mr. Barker, said the inspector quietly, we must keep you in sight until we have the warrant and can hold you. You can do what you damn well please about that, said Barker defiantly. The proceedings seemed to have come to a definite end so far as he was concerned, for one had only looked at the granite face to realize that no pene forte deatura would ever force him to plead against his will. The deadlock was broken, however, by a woman's voice. Mrs. Douglas had been standing listening in the half-open door, and she now entered the room. "You've done enough for us, Cecil," she said. "Whatever comes of it in the future, you have done enough." "Enough, and more than enough," remarked Sherlock Holmes gravely. "I have every sympathy with you, madam, and I should strongly urge you to have some confidence in the common sense of your jurisdiction, and to take the place voluntarily into your complete confidence. It may be that I myself am at fault for not following up the hint which you conveyed to me through my friend Dr. Watson, but at the time I had every reason to believe that you were directly concerned in the crime. Now I am assured that this is not so. At the same time, there is much that is unexplained, and I should strongly recommend that you ask Mr. Douglas to tell us his own story." Mrs. Douglas gave a cry of astonishment at Holmes's words. The detectives and I must have echoed it, when we were aware of a man who seemed to have emerged from the wall, and who advanced now from the gloom from the corner in which he had appeared. Mrs. Douglas turned, and in an instant her arms were around him. Barker had seized his outstretched hands. "It's the best this way, Jack," his wife repeated. "I'm sure that it is the best." "Indeed, yes, Mr. Douglas," said Sherlock Holmes. "I'm sure that you will find it best." The man stood blinking at us with a dazed look of one who comes from a dark into a light. It was a remarkable face. Bold grey eyes, a strong, short-clipped, grizzled mustache, and a square projecting chin, and a humorous mouth. He took a good look at us, and then, in my amazement, advanced to me and handed me a bundle of paper. "I've heard of you," said he in an American voice which was not quite English and not quite American, but was altogether mellow and pleasing. "You are the historian of this bunch. Well, Dr. Watson, you've never had such a story as that pass through your hands before, and I'll lay my last dollar on that. Tell it your way, but there are the facts, and you can't miss the public so long as you have those. I've been cooped up 2 days, and I've spent the daylight hours, as much daylight as I could get in that rat trap, and putting the thing into words. You're welcome, then, you and your public. There's the story of the Valley of Fear." "That's the past, Mr. Douglas," said Sherlock Holmes quietly. "What we desire now is to hear your story from the present." "You'll have it, sir," said Douglas. "Can I smoke as I talk? Well, thank you, Mr. Holmes. You're a smoker yourself, if I remember right. You'll guess what it is that'll be sitting for 2 days with tobacco in your pocket and afraid that the smell will give you away." He leaned against the mantelpiece and sucked at the cigar which Holmes had offered him. "I've heard of you, Mr. Holmes. I never guessed that I would meet you. But before you're through with that," he nodded to my papers, "you will say, I've brought you something fresh." Inspector MacDonald had been staring at the newcomer with the greatest amazement. "Well, this fairly beats me," he cried at last. "If you're Mr. John Douglas of Burlestone Manor, then whose death have we been investigating these past 2 days? And where in the world have you been sprung from now? You seem to come out of me like a jack-in-the-box." "Ah, Mr. Mac," said Holmes, shaking a reproving forefinger. "You would not read the excellent local compilation of described of concealment of King Charles. People did not hide in those days without reliable hiding places, and the hiding place that has once been used may be used again. I persuaded myself that we should find Mr. Douglas under this roof." "And how long have you been playing this trick upon us, Mr. Holmes?" the inspector said angrily. "How long have you allowed us to waste ourselves upon the search that you know is an absurd one?" "Not one instant, my dear Mr. Mac. Only last night did I form my views of this case, as they could not be put to the proof until this evening. I invited you and your colleague to take a holiday for the day. Pray, what more could I do? When I found the suit of clothes in the moat, it at once became apparent to me that the body we had found could not have been the body of Mr. John Douglas at all, but must be that of the cyclist from Turnbridge Wells. No other conclusion was possible. Therefore, I had to determine where Mr. John Douglas himself could be, and the balance of probability was that, with the connivance of his wife and his friend, he was concealed in the house, which he had conveniences for a fugitive, and awaiting quieter times, then he could make his final escape." "Well, you figured that out all right," said Mr. Douglas approvingly. "I thought I'd dodge your British law, for I was not sure how I stood under it. And also I saw my chance to throw these hounds once and for all off my track. Mind you, from first to last I could have done nothing to be ashamed of, and nothing that I would not do again. But you'll judge for yourselves when I tell you my story. Never mind warning me, Inspector. I've already stand pat in mind the truth." "I'm not going to begin at the beginning, that's all there. He indicated in my bundle of papers, and a mighty queer yarn you'll find it. It all comes down to this. There are some men that have good cause to hate me, and would give their last dollar to know that they had got me. So long as I'm alive and they're alive, there is no safety in this world for me. They hunted me from Chicago to California, then they chased me out of America. But when I married and settled down in this quiet spot, I thought my last years were going to be peaceable. I never explained to my wife how things were. Why should I put her into it? She would never have a quiet moment again, and would always be imagining trouble. I fancy she knew something, for I may have dropped a word here and a word there, but until yesterday, after you gentlemen had seen her, she never knew the rights of the matter. She told you all she knew, and so did Barker here, for on that night when this thing happened, there was a mighty little time for explanations. She knows everything now, and I would have been the wiser man if I had told her sooner. But it is a hard question." He took her hand for an instant in the sun, "and I acted for the best. Well, gentlemen, the day before these happenings, I was over in Tunbridge Wells, and I caught a glimpse of a man in the street. It was not only a glimpse, but I have a quick eye for these things, and I never doubted who it was. It was the worst enemy I had among all of them, one who has been after me like a hungry wolf after the caribou for all these years. I knew there was trouble coming, and I came home and made ready for it. I guessed I'd fight through it all right on my own, and there was a time when my luck and all the talk of the whole United States. I never doubted they would be with me still. I was on guard and all that next day and never went out into the park. It's as well, or he'd have had the drop on me with that buckshot gun on his before or after even I could have drawn on him. After the bridge was up, my mind was always more restful when that bridge was up in the evenings. I put the thing clear out of my head. I never figured on this gentleman in my house and waiting for me. But when I made my round in my dressing gown, as habit was, I had no sooner entered the study than I scented danger. I guess when a man has had dangers all his life, and I've had more than most of my time, there's a kind of sixth sense that waves a red flag. I saw the signal clear, and yet I couldn't tell you why. Next instant, I spotted a boot under the window curtain, and then I was behind plain enough. I just had just one candle that was in my hand, but there was a good light from the hall lamp and the open door. I put down the candle and jumped for a hammer that I left by the mantel. At the same moment he sprang at me, I saw a glint of a knife and he slashed at him with the hammer. I got him somewhere, for the knife trickled down onto the floor. He dodged around the table as quick as an eel, and a moment later he'd got his gun from under his coat. I heard him cock it, but I had got hold of it before he could fire. I had it by the barrel, and we wrestled for it all ends up for a minute or so. It was death to the man that lost his grip. He never lost his grip, but he got the butt downwards for a moment too long. Maybe it was just that I pulled the trigger. Maybe we just jolted it off of between us. Anyhow, he got both barrels in the face, and there I was, staring down at what was left of Ted Baldwin. I'd recognized him in the township, and over again he sprang at me. And by his own mother wouldn't recognize him as I saw him then. I'm used to rough work, but I fairly turned sick at the sight of him. I was hanging to the side of the table when Barker came hurrying down, and I heard my wife coming. Then I ran to the door and stopped her. There was no sight for a woman. I'd promised to come to her soon. I said a word or two to Barker, and he took it all at a glance. Then we waited for the rest to come along, but there was no sign of them. Then we understood that they could hear nothing, and that all that had happened was only known to ourselves. It was an instant that the idea came to me. I was fairly dazzled with the brilliancy of it. The man's sleeve was slipped up, and there was a branded mark on the lodge on his forearm. See here? The man whom we knew as Douglas turned up his own coat and showed off the round triangle within a circle, exactly like that which you had seen upon the dead man. It was the sight of that which startled me on it. I seemed to see it all clear at a glance. There was his height, and his figure was about the same as mine. No one could swear to his face, poor devil. I brought down the suit of clothes, and in a quarter of an hour Barker and I had put my dressing gown on him, and he lay as you found him. We tied all his things into a bundle, and I weighted them down with the only weight I could find and slung them out the window. The card he meant to lay upon my body was laying beside his own. My rings were put on his fingers, but when it came to my wedding ring, he held out his muscular hand. You can see for yourselves that I had struck my limit. I could not have moved it since the day I was married, and it would have had to take a file to get it off. I don't know anyhow that I would have cared to part for it, but if I'd wanted to, I couldn't. So we just had to leave that detail to take care of itself. On the other hand, I brought a bit of plaster down and put it where the wearing one myself had been in this instant. You slipped up there, Mr. Holmes, clever as you are, but if you had chanced to take off that plaster, you would have seen no cut underneath it. Well, that was the situation. If I could lie low for a while and then get away where I could be joined with my wife, we would have a chance at least of living in peace for the rest of our lives. These devils would give me no rest so long as I was above ground, but if they saw in the papers that Baldwin had got his man, there would be an end to my troubles. I had much time to make it clear to Barker and to my wife, but they understood enough to make it able for me. I knew all about this hiding place, and so did Ames, but it never entered his head to connect it with the matter. I retired into it, and it was up to Barker to do the rest. I guess you can fill yourselves in what he did. He opened the window and made a mark on the sill to give the idea of how the murderer escaped. It was a tall order, but as the bridge was up, there was no other way. Then, when everything was fixed, he rang the bell for all he was worth. What happened afterwards, you know, and so, gentlemen, you can do what you please. But I've told the truth and the whole truth, so help me God. What I ask you now is, how do I stand by the English law? There was a silence which was broken by Sherlock Holmes. The English law is, in the main, a just law. You will get no worse than your deserts from it. But I would ask you, how did this man know that you lived here, and how to get into your house, and where to hide to get to you? I know nothing of this. Holmes's face was very white and grave. The story is not over yet, he said. You may find worse dangers in English law, or even than your enemies from America. I see trouble for you, Mr. Douglas. You will take my advice and still be on your guard. And now, my long-suffering readers, I will ask you to come away with me for a time, far from the Sussex Manor House of Burlestone, and far also from the year of the grace in which we made our eventful journey, which ended with a strange story of the man who had been known as John Douglas. I wish you to journey back some 20 years in time and westward some thousands of miles in space, that it may lay before you a singular and terrible narrative, so singular and so terrible that you may find it hard to believe that, even as I tell it, even so did it occur. Do not think that I intrude one story before another is finished. As you read on, you will find that this is not so. And when I have detailed those distant events, and you have solved the mystery of the past, we shall meet once more in those rooms in Baker Street, where this, like so many other wonderful happenings, will find its end.